Imagine standing on an open plain, the ground trembling beneath thousands of marching feet. Bronze shields glint under the burning sun, spears bristle like a deadly forest, and a wall of men, Alexander the Great's Phalanx, pushes forward with unstoppable momentum. Now, fast forward 2,000 years. The ground shakes again, but this time it is not men, it is steel. Tanks, roaring engines, tracks grinding the earth, cannons thundering with fire and smoke. World War II. 2 ages. 2 unstoppable forces. But what happens when we dare to compare them? Could Alexander's disciplined phalanx, forged in the fires of ancient conquest, withstand the armored monsters of the 20th century? Or would tanks, creatures of steel and fuel, crush history's most disciplined warriors in minutes? It seems absurd, but history is never that simple. The phalanx was more than men and spears. It was a machine of flesh, strategy, and willpower. Tanks were more than engines and armor. They were symbols of modern war, terrifying, but not invincible. So, who truly held the ultimate weapon of war? And more importantly, what does this comparison reveal about how humanity has fought, suffered, and evolved on the battlefield? The answer is not what you think. What makes an army unstoppable? What is it that makes an army unstoppable? Is it numbers? Is it technology? Or is it the will of men who refuse to yield? Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen on the strength of their armies, and none were feared more in the ancient world than Alexander the Great's phalanx. Yet when we leap forward to the 20th century, we find another kind of terror rolling across battlefields: the tank. 2 weapons of war, separated by millennia, yet both designed with a single purpose: to break the enemy. But could they ever be compared? And if so, which would truly dominate? To understand this, we must first step back into the dust and blood of the 4th century BCE. Alexander's phalanx was not merely a formation, it was a living machine, perfected from the legacy of his father, King Philip II of Macedon. Imagine thousands of men, packed shoulder to shoulder, each holding a sarissa, a spear over 18 feet long, thrust forward in overlapping rows. From a distance, it looked less like men and more like a porcupine of death, advancing with slow, relentless force. The shields of the front ranks locked together, spears projecting outward in a wall that no cavalry dared charge, no infantry dared meet head-on. The genius of the phalanx was not just its discipline, but its unity. Each soldier or hoplite was only a single cog in the greater machine. Alone, a man with a spear was vulnerable. But within the phalanx, he became nearly invincible. As long as the formation held, it crushed all opposition. Under Alexander, this machine marched across Persia, stormed into India, and carved an empire stretching from Greece to the edge of the known world. The phalanx became a symbol of unstoppable conquest. Now let us jump across time, into the mud and smoke of World War II. The weapon of fear here was not a wall of men, it was the tank. A beast of steel, belching fire from its cannon, grinding through trenches and fortifications as though they were paper. The Germans called their armored warfare Blitzkrieg, lightning war. A strategy built on speed, shock, and overwhelming power. When tanks appeared on the horizon, entire armies broke and fled. Just as the phalanx had terrified ancient foes, the tank paralyzed 20th century soldiers. But what makes these 2 weapons, the phalanx and the tank, so similar despite their differences? The answer lies in psychology. In Alexander's day, when an enemy faced the phalanx, they saw not individual soldiers, but a wall of death. In World War II, when infantry stared at advancing tanks, they did not see men, they saw indestructible monsters of steel. Fear was their greatest weapon. And yet, both the phalanx and the tank carried hidden weaknesses. For the phalanx, its strength was also its fragility. It could crush anything in front of it, but if its formation broke, if the wall of spears lost cohesion, it collapsed into chaos. Cavalry striking from the side, or rough terrain breaking the ranks, could spell disaster. For the tank, its armor was mighty, but not invincible. Anti-tank guns, mines, or even desperate soldiers with grenades could bring them down. Both weapons, in their time, seemed unstoppable. Both were feared. And yet both had flaws waiting to be exploited. Now imagine the impossible. These 2 forces meeting on a battlefield. On one side, the disciplined phalanx, spears bristling, shields locked, men advancing in perfect unity. On the other, tanks rumbling forward, their engines roaring, cannons ready to fire. It feels like a mismatch, doesn't it? Flesh and bronze against steel and fire. But history is not always what it seems. Consider this. The Phalanx was built for open plains, where it could maintain its formation and grind forward. Tanks, too, relied on mobility and space. Place them both on the same field, and suddenly the clash does not feel so distant. Could spears hold against armor? Could strategy overcome technology? These are questions that echo not just across history, but into the very heart of human warfare. Because war has always been a test, not of weapons alone, but of adaptability. The Persians once thought their numbers would overwhelm Alexander, and yet they fell. The French once thought their Maginot Line would hold back Hitler's tanks, and yet it crumbled. Again and again, the question is asked, what truly makes an army unstoppable? The Phalanx was the ultimate weapon of the ancient world, just as the tank was the terror of the modern. But neither won by strength alone. They triumphed through fear, through discipline, through the illusion of invincibility. And when that illusion shattered, so too did their power. But here's the real mystery. What if Alexander, with his genius for strategy, had commanded tanks instead of spears? And what if World War II generals had been forced to command armies built only of phalanxes? Would history's greatest battles look the same, or would everything we know about war be rewritten? The answer lies in the battles themselves. And in the next chapter, we step into the dust and smoke of history's deadliest showdowns, where Alexander's phalanx first proved itself unstoppable, and where World War II tanks tore through the old ways of war like thunder from the future. Can discipline defeat firepower? Can discipline alone defeat firepower? It is a question that echoes across the centuries. Imagine two armies, separated by more than 2,000 years, yet both carrying the pride of their nations and the fear of their enemies. On one side, Alexander's phalanx, a wall of men advancing with mechanical precision. On the other, World War II tank divisions, machines of destruction roaring across fields and cities. But when we strip away the noise of technology and the dust of history, we find one chilling truth. Both forces were feared because they seemed unstoppable, until the moment they met an enemy who dared to adapt. Let us return first to the ancient world, to the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Alexander the Great, facing the Persian king Darius III, brought with him an army smaller in number but greater in unity. Darius had war elephants, thousands of cavalry, and tens of thousands more soldiers than Alexander. By all logic, the phalanx should have been crushed beneath the weight of numbers. Yet Alexander's genius was not in brute force, but in control. He knew the strength of the phalanx lay in discipline. He allowed his line to bend, to absorb the Persian onslaught, and then, like a coiled spring, he released his cavalry in a devastating charge. The phalanx held, the Persians faltered, and Darius fled the field. It was not just spears that won the battle, it was the unbreakable cohesion of men who trusted the formation more than they feared death. Now leap forward to 1940, as German tanks rolled through France. The French army, considered one of the strongest in Europe, believed they could hold back the enemy with fortifications, the Maginot Line. But tanks were not made to fight fair battles. They moved fast, ignored the defenses, and cut deep into the heart of France. Just as Darius's massive army crumbled before the disciplined phalanx, the French collapsed under the relentless firepower and mobility of Blitzkrieg. The lesson was the same, whether in the dust of Gaugamela or the smoke of France. Numbers and walls mean nothing when faced with a weapon or a strategy that refuses to play by the rules. And yet, there is a hidden similarity here. The phalanx was terrifying to those who had never faced it, but it was not invincible. At the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197 BCE, the Romans exploited the phalanx's rigidity. Using their more flexible legions, they struck when the Macedonian line became disordered on uneven ground. The phalanx, unable to adapt, broke apart. Centuries later, the tank too faced its moment of reckoning. In North Africa, Rommel's panzers were first unstoppable, sweeping aside British forces. But when the Allies learned to coordinate air power, anti-tank weapons, and mobile infantry, the illusion of invincibility shattered. Just like the phalanx, the tank could be beaten by those who understood its weaknesses. But here is the true question: what happens when human courage collides with mechanical terror? Consider a Greek hoplite, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, his sarissa trembling in his grip, his shield pressed tight against his arm. Across the centuries, picture a French or Soviet infantryman in 1941, staring down the barrel of a panzer tank, clutching nothing more than a rifle or a Molotov cocktail. Both men faced what seemed like certain death. And yet both stood their ground. The Phalanx soldier believed in the strength of his formation. The World War II infantryman trusted his brothers in arms and the slim hope of a well-thrown explosive. In both cases, survival was born from unity, not from individual heroism. But discipline can only carry men so far. At Issus, Alexander's phalanx marched through chaos, enduring arrows and cavalry charges, but never breaking ranks. In Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers endured shelling and tank assaults, fighting not just for survival but for every inch of their shattered city. The Phalanx won through sheer cohesion, the Soviets won through sheer resilience. Both remind us that even against overwhelming firepower, the human will to endure can turn the tide of war. Still, there is an unsettling thought. Could Alexander's Phalanx ever truly stand against tanks? Spears against steel, flesh against firepower, it feels like a hopeless contest. And yet, consider terrain. Tanks thrive on open plains, just as the Phalanx does. But what happens when the battlefield is rough, broken, or urban? The Phalanx collapses in such conditions, but tanks too become vulnerable, lumbering beasts trapped in narrow streets or bogged down in mud. Perhaps in some twisted mirror of history, both forces might find themselves equally crippled outside their chosen ground. So the question deepens. Is it discipline or firepower that wins wars? Or is it adaptability, the ability to bend without breaking, that truly decides the outcome? Alexander bent his line at Gaugamela, then struck with precision. Hitler bent France's defenses with Blitzkrieg, striking where they were weak. The Persians and the French both failed because they clung to rigid systems. The victors, whether armed with spears or tanks, triumphed because they dared to adapt. And this brings us to a haunting thought. If Alexander himself, a man who mastered strategy at such a young age, had commanded tanks instead of spearmen, what would the world look like today? Would empires stretch even farther, cities fall even quicker? And conversely, if generals of World War II had been armed only with phalanxes, could they have held back the tides of modern war? The answer lies not in the weapons themselves, but in the minds of those who wield them. And in the next chapter, we confront that very truth, by placing Alexander's greatest triumphs side by side with the most devastating battles of World War II, and asking, were the men who fought so different after all? Do battles across centuries speak the same language of war? Do battles across centuries speak the same language of war? Can the clash of spears on an ancient plain whisper the same story as the thunder of tanks across Europe? At first glance, they seem worlds apart. Alexander's phalanx belonged to a time of kings and empires, of swords and shields, of dusty plains stretching into the horizon. World War II belonged to the age of industry, where steel and machines ruled the battlefield, and the sky itself rained fire. Yet beneath the layers of time, the rhythm of war remains hauntingly familiar. Armies meet, courage is tested, fear spreads like wildfire, and in the end, only one side endures. Let us step first into the dust of Gaugamela, 331 BCE. Picture it, Alexander faces the Persian king Darius, outnumbered 5-1. Tens of thousands of Persian infantry stretch across the horizon. War chariots bristle with blades fixed to their wheels, waiting to mow down Macedonian ranks. The Persians seem invincible, their sheer mass enough to crush any foe. Yet Alexander, calm at the center of the storm, trusts in his phalanx. His soldiers know their role. The sarissas lower. Shields lock. The Persian chariots charge. Dust and terror rise, but the wall holds. Spears pierce horses, men scream, the phalanx absorbs the blow. Step by step, with unbreakable unity, they push forward. And when the moment comes, Alexander himself leads his cavalry through a gap, slicing into the heart of Darius's army. The Persians break. Fear spreads. Victory belongs to discipline, to timing, to the machine of men that refuse to yield. Now, shift your eyes 2,000 years ahead, to Stalingrad, 1942. It is winter. The Volga River is frozen with corpses. The German army, once unstoppable with its tanks and Blitzkrieg, now finds itself trapped in a nightmare. Street by street, building by building, the Soviets hold their ground. Tanks rumble down shattered avenues, but Soviet soldiers swarm them with Molotov cocktails, grenades, and rifles. They fight in sewers, in basements, even in the ruins of factories. Like Alexander's phalanx, they refuse to break, no matter how overwhelming the enemy. And then, like Alexander striking at Gaugamela, the Soviets unleash their counterattack, Operation Uranus. They encircle the German Sixth Army. The hunters become the hunted. Just as Darius fled before Alexander, the German army collapses in terror and starvation. Different weapons. Different centuries. But the same pattern of war, the few holding against the many, discipline and timing turning the tide, fear transforming the invincible into the defeated. And yet, there is another story here. At Issus, Alexander stood against the Persians again, and once more the Phalanx proved its worth. The line bent but did not break, and Alexander's personal leadership cut through the enemy. The result was chaos for Persia. Compare this to El Alamein, 1942. Rommel's Africa Corps, the so-called Desert Fox, had raced across North Africa. His tanks were feared. The British, battered and desperate, prepared their defense. Yet just as Alexander had used the terrain at Issus to pin his foes, the Allies used the desert to trap the Germans. Mines, artillery, and coordinated assaults turned Rommel's advance into a retreat. The phalanx of Alexander and the tanks of Rommel, so different, yet both reliant on cohesion and terrain. Both crumbled when the enemy adapted faster. Then comes the greatest clash of tanks in history, Kursk, 1943. Over 6,000 tanks collided across the Russian steppes. The Germans, seeking to regain their lost power, unleashed armored divisions like a steel tide. But the Soviets had prepared. Mines littered the fields, trenches scarred the earth, artillery waited in silence. The German tanks rolled forward, and for a moment it seemed unstoppable. Yet, like a phalanx struggling on uneven ground, the tanks faltered against the obstacles. The Soviets counterattacked with their own armored divisions, and the greatest tank battle in history ended with the Germans in retreat. Kursk was the cynocephaly of the 20th century, the day when the illusion of invincible machines was shattered by strategy and preparation. Here is where the comparison becomes almost eerie. The phalanx and the tank were never just weapons, they were psychological storms. At Gaugamela, Persian soldiers fled not because they were defeated everywhere, but because fear spread faster than steel. At Stalingrad, German troops did not collapse only because of hunger and cold, but because their minds could no longer bear the siege. In both cases, morale was the silent weapon. And morale, once broken, is harder to rebuild than any spear or tank. Yet imagine the men themselves. A Macedonian hoplite, sweat dripping down his brow, hands blistered from gripping the sarissa, marching under the merciless sun. A Soviet soldier, frost biting his skin, fingers numb around his rifle, crouched in the ruins of a city. Separated by centuries, but both gripped by fear, both clinging to the belief that their formation, their comrades, their discipline, would carry them through. War, stripped of its weapons, is always about the human heart. And so we ask again, do battles across centuries speak the same language? The answer is yes. Not in the weapons, not in the tactics, but in the eternal struggle between fear and courage, order and chaos, unity and collapse. The phalanx and the tank may seem impossibly different, but they serve the same role, to terrify the enemy, to break their spirit before breaking their bodies. But here lies the deeper mystery. If war always speaks the same language, then are we doomed to repeat its lessons, century after century? Did Alexander's victories foreshadow the battles of World War II? Or did the tanks of Kursk and Stalingrad merely echo the ancient truths of Gaugamela and Issus? And in the next chapter, we will take that haunting thought further, by asking what happens when leaders themselves become the ultimate weapon. Could Alexander's genius outmatch the minds of generals like Rommel, Zhukov, or Patton? Could one man's brilliance outweigh even the might of tanks? Is the greatest weapon the leader himself? Is the greatest weapon on the battlefield not the spear, nor the tank, but the mind that commands them? When we strip war down to its bones, it is not the machine or the formation that writes history, it is the leader who dares to wield them. Alexander the Great, riding at the head of his cavalry, believed that victory came not only from strategy but from presence. His soldiers did not just fight for conquest, they fought for him. In World War II, the same truth surfaced again and again. Generals whose names became legend, not for the weapons they commanded, but for the way they inspired men to fight when all seemed lost. Alexander was more than a king. He was a commander who led from the front. At Gaugamela, when the Persian army towered over his smaller force, he did not hide behind lines of spearmen. He rode into the gap himself, leading the charge that cut the heart out of Darius's army. His men saw him as invincible, a man favored by the gods. And in that belief, they found courage. They stood their ground not only because the Phalanx demanded it, but because Alexander's eyes were on them, and he too risked death at their side. Now imagine General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. He did not fight with spears but with tanks, sweeping across North Africa with speed and daring. Rommel, like Alexander, believed in leading close to the front. He toured the battlefield, inspected the terrain, spoke directly to his men. His presence gave confidence. His soldiers felt that they were part of something greater than themselves, a strategy that was alive, flexible, and bold. For a time, Rommel's daring felt unstoppable. His tanks struck like lightning, much as Alexander's cavalry once had. But leadership is not only about daring. It is about vision. Alexander's vision stretched across continents. He sought not just victory, but empire. His campaigns were fueled by ambition to unite East and West, to create a legacy beyond war. Compare this with General Zhukov of the Soviet Union. At Stalingrad, he oversaw one of the most brutal turning points of World War II. Zhukov's leadership was not reckless or romantic. It was cold, calculating, and relentless. He sacrificed divisions, absorbed casualties in numbers unimaginable to the ancient world, and still pushed forward. Like Alexander, he demanded that his men endure the impossible. Unlike Alexander, he commanded not from the front lines, but from the machinery of a modern state that demanded victory at all costs. Yet the effect was the same. Soldiers endured because they believed in the leader's purpose. Whether standing in the heat of Gaugamela or freezing in the rubble of Stalingrad, men held fast because they were commanded by minds that could see beyond the chaos of the battlefield. But leadership can also falter. Darius fled Gaugamela, abandoning his men, and the Persian army dissolved in panic. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad received no mercy from Hitler, who refused to let them retreat. Leadership became poison. Where Alexander inspired survival, and Zhukov demanded it, Hitler's stubbornness ensured destruction. The question then is not just whether a leader is bold or calculating, it is whether he can adapt, whether he can bend without breaking, whether he can inspire his men to endure the storm. Alexander mastered this balance. He was bold when opportunity appeared, cautious when danger loomed, and always ready to adapt. At Hydaspes, when facing war elephants in India, he did not rush his phalanx headlong. He waited for the right moment, used his cavalry to outmaneuver, and struck with precision. His men, though terrified of the elephants, trusted his judgment. Likewise, General Patton in World War II brought with him a reputation for aggression and daring, but also for timing. At the Battle of the Bulge, when the Allies were caught off guard by a German offensive, it was Patton who pivoted his army with incredible speed, striking at the enemy's flank and saving the campaign. Both Alexander and Patton thrived on momentum, on seizing the moment before the enemy could adjust. But here lies the haunting thought. If Alexander had commanded tanks, would his genius have magnified beyond imagination? Would Blitzkrieg under Alexander have conquered not just Europe, but the world? And what if Zhukov or Patton had been placed in charge of the Phalanx? Would their minds have found ways to adapt its rigidity, to bend where ancient Macedonian generals could not? The truth is, leadership turns weapons into more than weapons. A phalanx without Alexander was simply men with spears. Tanks without generals like Rommel or Zhukov were simply machines of steel. The presence of a brilliant leader transforms an army into something greater, a force that believes it cannot be stopped. That belief is often the deciding factor. But leadership carries another burden. The greater the leader, the greater the cost if he falls. When Alexander died at just 32, his empire fractured, torn apart by his generals. The phalanx, once unstoppable, became vulnerable. In World War II, when Rommel fell from Hitler's favor and later took his own life, German forces in North Africa faltered without his guiding hand. The tank divisions that once cut through deserts now stumbled. Leadership, as much as weapons, determines whether an army endures or collapses. So perhaps the greatest weapon of all is not the spear, nor the tank, but the vision of the man who wields them. Alexander's brilliance turned the phalanx into an empire. Zhukov's cold resolve turned battered Soviet forces into the victors of Stalingrad. Patton's speed turned the tide in Europe. Rommel's daring almost gave Hitler victory in North Africa. Their strategies differed, their weapons differed, but their influence was the same. They were the soul of their armies. But this opens the final, most dangerous question. If men like Alexander, Zhukov, Rommel, and Patton shape wars through their vision, then is war itself inevitable? As long as great leaders rise, will humanity always find new ways to fight, new weapons to wield, new armies to march? In the next chapter, we confront the ultimate question. When unstoppable forces meet, whether spears or tanks, what happens to the men trapped between them? And what does it reveal about the true cost of war? When unstoppable forces collide, who truly pays the price? When unstoppable forces collide, who truly pays the price? Is it the generals whose names echo through history? Is it the kings and dictators who gamble with lives for power? Or is it the soldiers, ordinary men trapped between ambition and destruction, who carry the weight of those collisions on their backs? Alexander's Phalanx and the tanks of World War II remind us of glory, of triumph, of unstoppable conquest. But beneath that shine lies something darker, the endless human cost that fuels the engines of war. Picture the Phalanx at Gaugamela. Thousands of Macedonian hoplites shoulder to shoulder, sweat pouring down their faces, spears heavy in their hands, fear pressing into their chests like a second shield. Behind their locked shields, they cannot even see the enemy clearly, only the forest of sarissas before them and the trembling of the ground as Persian chariots thunder closer. They know that if the line breaks, they will be trampled, cut down, butchered without mercy. And so they stand, not because they are fearless, but because they have no choice. Their strength lies in their unity, in the certainty that death awaits if they falter. Each victory Alexander carved into history was paid for with blood, not just Persian blood, but Macedonian as well. Behind the stories of triumph lies the silence of thousands of men who never returned home. Now leap across centuries to a tank battle on the Eastern Front. The summer of 1943. Kursk. The largest armored clash in history. Over 6,000 tanks roar across the steppe, their cannons spitting fire, their tracks grinding the earth into dust. German crews sit inside claustrophobic steel beasts, ears ringing from constant bombardment, sweat and smoke filling their lungs. Soviet crews endure the same terror, knowing that any shell could pierce their armor and turn the tank into a fiery coffin. When tanks collide, the men inside them are swallowed whole by the machine of war. There is no shield wall to lock together, no comrade's shoulder brushing against yours, only the groan of steel, the shaking of the ground, and the knowledge that you are a single spark away from death. The Phalanx and the tank may look different, but the men inside them share the same fate. They are trapped in formations larger than themselves, pawns in strategies far beyond their control. The Macedonian soldier could not decide whether Alexander would march east or west. The German tank commander could not decide whether Hitler would invade Russia. Both fought where they were told, bled where they were ordered, and died for dreams that were never theirs. And yet, amid this horror, there is another truth. Human resilience. In Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers fought on with nothing but rubble for shelter, starving, freezing, yet refusing to yield. In Hydaspes, Alexander's men, exhausted after years of conquest, still found the will to march against Indian war elephants, beasts they had never seen before. Fear pressed against them like a wall, but they broke through it. Again and again, history shows that the strength of an army is not only in its weapons but in the hearts of men who refuse to surrender, even when logic says they should. But here is the cruelest twist. Victories may live forever in history, but the human suffering fades into shadows. We remember Alexander's empire, but not the countless families left without sons. We remember the turning points of World War II, but not the voices silenced inside burning tanks. War creates legends, but it buries humanity. The Phalanx and the tank both became symbols of unstoppable power, but behind every symbol are graves. So when unstoppable forces collide, who truly pays? It is the soldier crushed beneath the weight of ambition. It is the farmer who becomes a hoplite. The factory worker who becomes a tank gunner. The boy who becomes cannon fodder. Generals may plan, kings may dream, dictators may boast, but the true cost is always borne by those who never chose the battlefield. And yet, perhaps that is why we remember them. Perhaps that is why the stories of the Phalanx and the tank continue to echo across centuries. Not because they show us glory, but because they remind us of what it costs to chase glory. They remind us that even the mightiest armies, the deadliest machines, and the most brilliant leaders stand on the shoulders of ordinary men who gave everything. So we return to the question. Alexander's Phalanx versus World War II tanks. Who would win? In truth, the answer does not matter. For war is never won by weapons alone. The The Phalanx triumphed because men believed in their leader. Tanks triumphed because men endured terror inside steel coffins. What unites them is not victory, but sacrifice. And perhaps the final lesson is this: no matter how advanced the weapon, no matter how brilliant the strategy, war will always demand its price in human lives. Alexander's empire crumbled when he died, leaving only ruins. World War II ended with cities in ashes, millions dead, and a world scarred forever. The Phalanx and the tank, unstoppable in their time, were both eventually outmatched, replaced, and remembered only as echoes of power.